It seems to me that one of the most interesting questions that we can ask of ourselves and of our lives is not whether or not we're doing what we want to do, but whether or not we are doing what we ought to do. And that is a difficult thing for us to think about, because in our culture, the former question preoccupies us the most easily. The primary criteria by which we assess the worth of things is essentially a selfish one. We subconsciously ask ourselves, is this responsibility that I have? Is this relationship that I am in? Is this behavioural pattern that I am forming? Is this financial expenditure that I am considering something that I want to do? Whether or not it is something that we ought to do rarely enters our thinking. And the human cost of that selfishness is enormous. When we walk out of the family home to be in the arms of the person with whom we are having an affair, we are doing what we want to do, but we're not thinking about what we ought to do. When we watch television or go out drinking with our mates rather than spending time with our children, we're doing what we want to do, but we're not thinking about what we ought to do. When we give in to our addictions and temptations, we are thinking in those moments very powerfully about what we want to do, but we are not giving enough thought to what we ought to do. And I would suggest to you that we all need to remind ourselves that the choices and the decisions that we make every day of our lives are taking us somewhere. Whether it's good or bad is irrelevant, it's somewhere. And if we make decisions based solely upon the criteria of what we want to do, without paying due care and attention to what we ought to do, the somewhere where we end up will be unpleasant. And I mention all that because the words that we're going to read through this morning were first written to men and women living in Rome in the mid-60s of the first century. Prior to that, each of them had made a commitment to follow the teachings of Jesus. And now in the mid-60s, that commitment was proving difficult. The Roman historian Tacitus says of Christianity in Rome during this period that an arrest was made of all who confessed to the Christian faith. Following this arrest, an immense multitude were convicted. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn apart by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to flames. So you see what Tacitus is saying there. He's saying Christians weren't just arrested in Rome in those days, and they weren't just killed. They were killed in as entertaining a way as possible. They were killed in a way that belongs in a Netflix horror series. They were killed graphically, grotesquely, Stephen Kingly, okay? And it is a historical fact that faced with such grisly deaths, many of these early Christians simply stopped being Christian. And that stopping was based upon a very simple and understandable criteria. Because what I want to do, you see, is live. What I want to do, thank you very much, is not get eaten by lions. What I want to do is not get burned at the stake or suffer as a cruel spectacle in Nero's games. That is what I want to do. And as they read the words that we're going to read through this morning, those early Christians were reminded that following Jesus and doing the right thing is not always what a person wants to do. Let's just get that straight, yeah? Christianity often isn't fun. And sometimes it doesn't make your life better, quote unquote. Often it is not what a person wants to do, but it is, the apostle would argue, always the right thing to do and what one ought to do. So we begin in verse 1 of chapter 15. Where we read that very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision. Pretty good for a committee. They bound Jesus led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. So last Sunday we learned that the Sanhedrin, who functioned as the Jewish Supreme Court, found Jesus guilty of the religious charge of blasphemy, a charge which for them in their Jewishness carried the death penalty. So when verse 1 says that they reached a decision, what it means is that they reached a decision that they wanted to kill Jesus. However, they're not allowed to kill Jesus. In the year 6 AD, Judea became a Roman province. And in Roman provinces, the only people who are allowed to do any killing are the Romans. So in order to get Jesus killed, these people need to have him convicted by a Roman judge of a Roman crime. So Mark says that very early in the morning, they go to a Roman court to speak to a Roman judge. By the way, the reason they have to go early in the morning is because Roman legal proceedings started at 6 o'clock. And the reason they started at 6 o'clock was because the Roman legal establishment liked to have their day's work done by 10:30 in the morning so that they could go to the gym. I love these Italians. Fantastic. So picture the scene. It's 5:30 in the morning. Jesus has been up all day, the day before, and all night. Pontius Pilate, the Roman judge, checks into work. Waiting for him outside his office are the entire Jewish Supreme Court and a handcuffed Jesus. When he sees these things, he's thinking two things. First of all, he's thinking, can we get this wrapped up by 10:30? Because my trainer's booked for then. And then I got a masseuse at 11:30, then I'm playing golf with my buddies. So hopefully this won't be too long. And the second thing he's thinking, importantly, is what do these pain-in-the-neck Jews want now? And I know that because historians from the period give the very distinct impression that Pilate hated the Jews and he had no tolerance for what he considered their weird religious sensibilities. Pilate was, his title was the Roman prefect of Judea. Most parts of the Roman Empire were governed by very senior senators or consuls or legates. The territory administered by these important people was vast. The resources at their disposal was huge. However, some parts of the empire, parts that were considered politically sensitive, troublesome and dangerous, were governed by prefects. Prefects were like troubleshooters. They were the Roman equivalent of bouncers. People sent in to break skulls and knock sense into people. The Jews were notoriously awkward. They had a reputation for being resistant to Roman rule. And so for that reason, the people whom Rome sent to govern Judea were without exception hard men. And Pilate was one of the hardest. In the words of Philo, the Jewish historian, he was stubborn, inflexible, and cruel. So for example, on one occasion, Pilate began to understood that there was a Jewish commandment about not having any images anywhere. The Jews didn't like images of humans anywhere. Remember the commandment, thou shalt have no graven image. So Pilate thought it'll be fun to put images all around Jerusalem. So he plastered images of his boss, the emperor, all around the holy city. The Jews went ballistic. Thousands of them marched to Caesarea, to his palace, sat outside his door, like those hippie protests in the 60s, you know, we shall not be moved. You remember those. And they said, we're not moving until you take down those images of the emperor. Pilate said to them, move, or I'll have your throat slit. You know what the Jews did then? They unbuttoned their collars, bared their throats, and said, go ahead and slit them. But we're not moving until you take down those images. We know that in this episode, Pilate learned two things. Jews are a pain in the ass. Secondly, most importantly, they are serious about what they believe. And if they don't get their way, they're going to cause trouble. This lesson was not lost on Pilate, and it bears out on how he reacts to Jesus in the following story. So Pilate would have been given a pre-trial briefing by the Sanhedrin, who the night before found Jesus guilty of blasphemy. But they know that to get Jesus killed, he's going to have to be found guilty of a Roman crime. Romans don't care about blasphemy. They don't care about taking the Jewish God's name in vain. So very cunningly, they accuse Jesus not of blasphemy now, but of terrorism and sedition against Rome. This is why Pilate, in response to his pre-trial briefing, says to Jesus, "So is this true? Are you the king of the Jews?" Being the king of the Jews never came up in Jesus' trial the night before. But they have to twist it to get something that sticks. Now, to a Roman judge, this is serious. Since Pompey's capture of Jerusalem in 63 BC, every single leader of every single Jewish terrorist organization called him or herself a Messiah and or the King of the Jews. And so to a Roman judge, the phrase King of the Jews means terrorist. It means sedition. It means rebellion. For a Jew, Messiah is an okay term, but for a Roman it means something completely different. So where Jesus was comfortable with this word Messiah and this phrase King of the Jews in a Jewish context, now in a Roman court, he isn't keen on it. And so when Pilate asks him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Jesus shrugs his shoulders somewhat and says, "Yeah, it's as you say." Deliberately ambiguous. What Jesus is saying in this ambiguity is, yes, I suppose I am the King of the Jews, but not in the sense that you understand. I am what you say, but not what you mean. And when Jesus says this to Pilate, Pilate seems to get it. Pilate's a hard man, used to dealing with hard men his whole life. He looks at Jesus, he knows he's not one of them. He knows Jesus isn't a terrorist. Takes one look at him and he gets that. And when the Sanhedrin see Jesus get through to Pilate, they get nervous. So look at what they do next. They start to accuse him of many things. So the strategy now is, let's just throw a whole bunch of mud at the wall and hope that some of it sticks. You ever been in that situation? The lies they told about you didn't seem to get any traction, so let's just throw a whole bunch of stuff at you. Do anything we can to ruin you and damage your reputation, and sooner or later something somehow will stick and bring you down. So in the next sentence, Pilate again asks him, with some sympathy I think, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of." You can hear the sarcasm in his voice. I mean, the only thing they've missed out is the assassination of JFK. Jesus, don't you want to say something? But still Jesus made no reply. And I think, I'm certain in fact, that the reason Jesus says nothing isn't because he has nothing to say. Jesus, we know from the rest of the story, in fact, had brilliant one-liners. Jesus had the capacity to respond to awkwardness and sarcasm and attacks and rumours and totally disarm the situation. This time, he says nothing. And it's not because sometimes nothing is the right thing to say, which it is, by the way. Sometimes the best thing you can say in a situation is nothing at all. Because it doesn't matter what you say, it's going to be wrong and you're not going to change their mind anyway. But that's not it. 6 hours earlier, remember what Jesus had done. He was in the Garden of Gethsemane. He knew exactly what was coming for him the following day, and he got on his knees. And he said essentially, "Father, I know that your will is for me to die on the cross for the sins of the world. That's something I really don't want to do. I don't want to do any of it. What's in store for me tomorrow, I do not want. And then remember what he said. But nevertheless, not your will. Not my will, but your will be done. Jesus affirming in that difficult moment 6 hours earlier that the number one priority in his life isn't what I want to do, but what I ought to do. I think I was about 17 or 18 when it finally dawned on me that a large part of living in this world simply involves knuckling down and getting on with things. We don't like that anymore. I think we're all fed a lie that we have to be living some kind of dream, and you know, every day has to be, you know, our A1 dream life and all that stuff. And I don't buy that. I think a huge part of living just involves getting on with it. There's nothing wrong with that. Not because you want to, but because it's your job. Not because you want to, but because you have to. The time I had this realization, I was working in a fish business, and I enjoyed parts of the job, working with customers and so on, and selling things, but big parts of the job I didn't enjoy, mainly the working with fish bit. So we had a contract, I think I have a photo here, yeah, we had a great contract that I won, by the way. Not bragging, but I won it. Didn't get any appreciation, then or now. So I got this contract to sell scraps, basically, to a cat food company. And so the contract was we had to dehead tons and tons of salmon heads, and of salmon I should say, and those heads got pulped into cat food. And as you can see, I think from the photo, it was a cold, it was an unpleasant, it was a messy job. And you know, honestly, hand on my heart, no word of a lie, when you're standing there at 6 o'clock in the morning with numb fingers, freezing cold, with guts and smell all around you, working with Neanderthals, knuckles scraping the ground, at no point in that experience are you thinking, this is my dream. This is the life of which I have long dreamt. But you are thinking, if you're thinking straight, I'm getting paid for this. I don't need appreciation from my boss. I don't need a hug from my boss. I don't want a hug from my boss. Do you know what I need from my boss? Pay. So I'll chop it, I'll shovel it, I'll take it. You don't have to give me anything. Just pay at the end of the day. And what's wrong with that? No? No. We don't think that way anymore? And we all know what that's like. Don't tell me, don't you dare tell me that you bounce out of bed every single morning of your life and say, woohoo, I'm so excited, today I get to deal with awkward people. That's what I always wanted. Don't tell me in September you're going to run to school every single day and say it's so fantastic, I get to go to class and have no clue what the professors are talking about and get an assignment that I have no clue how to complete. That's what I always wanted. This is life. There are large areas of life where, you know what, you just have to do things because they are the things that you have to do. Not because they're fun, not because they're awesome. You do them because you ought to, because it is the right thing to do. That's life. And I can assure you that the first century Christians to whom these words were first written were never getting out of bed in the morning and saying to themselves with disgusting enthusiasm, this is a great day where I get to follow the teachings of Jesus. And by nightfall, my body might illuminate one of Nero's palaces. That's what I always wanted. And so for them to read that Jesus is silently, stoically, deliberately doing not that which he necessarily wanted to do, but rather that which he ought to do, it must have had a motivating effect on their life. Say what you want. Accuse me of what you want. You can beat me, you can whip me, you can kill me. I'm going to do what I have to do. Because I am. Because I am. Mark says that when Pilate heard Jesus is nothing, when he saw his stoicism, his determination, his courage, Pilate, Mark says, was amazed. Interesting word. Remember when I told you the story about the time Pilate put images of the emperor around Jerusalem and the people protested and said, you can slit our throats if you want to. Remember I told you that story? Mm-hmm. You should, it was 2 minutes ago. Well, here's the interesting thing. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing not long after the period, very distinctly says that when Pilate saw the courage and the determination of those people willing to have their throats slit, Pilate was amazed. 2 times Pilate is said to have used this word amazed. Once when the Jewish mob bared their throats and said, go ahead, do what you got to do, but we're not moving. And the other time when Jesus says nothing. I'm going to do what I have to do. Not because it's fun, but because I ought to. And so now, Pilate is certain, 100% certain, that Jesus doesn't deserve to die. He knows. He just knows. And at this point, with the use of this word amazed, Pilate is determined to set Jesus free. But he has to be careful. The Jewish Supreme Court, whom he hates, want Jesus dead. And Pilate knows better than anyone how awkward they can be when they don't get their own way. So conveniently for him, verse 6, it was the custom at the feast of Passover to release a prisoner whom the people requested. So the thinking behind this custom was that it made the normally harsh Roman governor seem a little less harsh. The Roman governor didn't live in Jerusalem. It wasn't a nice city to live in. He lived at a seaside resort called Caesarea. And he only ever came to Jerusalem for major festivals, of which Passover was the largest. The Jews hated his presence. So in a PR stunt, every time he came to the city, he granted amnesty to a popular prisoner. Mark says that one particular criminal called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder during the uprising. So this is an insight into the kind of people Pilate deals with every day. Hard men with Semtex and AKs and long knives, and Barabbas is among them. A terrorist through and through. And so the crowd came up and they asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. So Barabbas, as a political prisoner, as a member, perhaps even as a leader of a Jewish resistant movement, he's a hero of the people. Naturally, they know that Pilate's going to release one of their prisoners, and so they ask him to release Barabbas. Pilate uses this as an opportunity to set Jesus free. He says in verse 9, "Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" I think when he says this, he's just trying to annoy the Sanhedrin. I think whenever the Sanhedrin asked him anything, he was resistant. And you know, he doesn't say this because he knows they're up to something. He's not 100% sure why they want Jesus dead, but he knows it's not wholesome. And so he's winding them up here. He says, "I'll give amnesty to your king," knowing that it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed him over. However, the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. In the Eastern world, there's a saying that's used to explain unusual relationships between normally hostile people. The saying goes like this: "The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The enemy of my enemy is my friend." The Jewish crowd standing outside the courtroom sense in this moment that Pilate is coming out to bat for Jesus. They sense that Pilate is sympathetic to Jesus. And so they naturally assume if our enemy is coming out to bat for Jesus, then we must be for the other guy. The friend of my enemy is my enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Is that complicated to understand? I don't think so. For example, I'll just explain it like this. On Wednesday, like I'm British. On Wednesday, when England play Croatia in the World Cup, I'll be Croatian. Understand? Okay, you don't understand. The Habs, let's say you're a Leafs fan. The Habs make it to the Stanley Cup final against Washington. The Habs are Canadian. One of us. You shouting for the Habs? No. Not a chance. This is what's going on in this story. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the funny thing is that the chief priests are stirring up all this. They're the aristocrats of Judea. They hated everything that Barabbas stood for. They hated insurrection. They hated terrorism. It was bad for business. They loved the Romans. They made money out of the Romans. But in normally hostile circumstances, the enemy of my enemy is always my friend. I dare say you see this at work all the time. Two people who are normally not at all close, perhaps who are even antagonistic, are drawn together by their common dislike of some new policy or perhaps some new supervisor. And they talk about it over lunch. And the only thing that they have in common is their dislike of this person or this policy. And those relationships, by the way, are always toxic. They're always doomed to disaster. If the only thing you have in common with someone else is your dislike of something else, that's never going to work. And this relationship here in this story doesn't work. More on that another time. So anyway, they shout for Pilate to grant amnesty to Barabbas. This naively seems to have shocked Pilate, who continues to negotiate. Because if Barabbas is set free, that means Jesus is not. So he asks in the next sentence, so what do you want me to do with Jesus? What do you want me to do with the King of the Jews? Amazingly, they shout out, crucify him. These are Jews saying this. They hate crucifixion. It is a symbol of Roman oppression. This is the plan though, remember? Jesus threatened the Jewish temple. Hundreds of important people in Jerusalem relied on the temple for their status, their power, their business, their income. Jesus has to die. This is being driven by corrupt people afraid of losing money. Pilate, again shocked in the next sentence, says, why? Why am I going to crucify him? Can't I just rough him up? Can't I just throw him in jail for a week? What crime has he committed to deserve crucifixion? But logic's not on the menu. They shout all the louder, crucify him. Then in verse 15, wanting, notice what it says, to satisfy the crowd. Remember what Pilate knows about the Jews. Remember the bare the throat episode. He releases Barabbas to them. Then he turns to Jesus and speaks the Latin words, ibis in curesum, mount him upon the cross. Then Mark says that he has Jesus flogged and handed over. The phrase handed over is significant to readers of the Bible. It's loaded. It reminds us as readers of the story that what's happening to Jesus here is not tragedy, but rather part of God's plan. It's not what Jesus wants to do, it's what he ought to do. He knows why he's come, he knows why he's got to die. One of the mantras of the early church was that Jesus was handed over by God's set purpose. It was God's plan that he should die for your sins and for mine. And again, the message here is that Jesus is submitting himself not to what he wants, but to what he ought to do. And it's traditionally told us that the flogging of Jesus was cruel. But particularly cruel crucifixions never involved floggings. The floggings were done for humanitarian reasons. So those of you who've seen The Passion of the Christ will no doubt remember the scene where Jesus is flogged, and it was horrific, and it was horrific. But for all of its horror, the reason the Romans flogged people who were sentenced to be crucified was to shorten the even greater horror of being crucified. And if you were really lucky, you died during the flogging. And this is what Pilate's hoping for. I'll tell the crowd I'm going to crucify Jesus, but let's flog him first. And if he's lucky, he'll die. And if he's not lucky, we'll knock 90% of the life out of him. And he won't suffer too long on the cross. Next sentence. The soldiers led Jesus away to the palace, that is the Praetorium. So remember, Mark's writing for a Roman audience, so he uses Roman terms. And he calls together the whole company of soldiers, 600 of them. They rough Jesus up a bit. They put the crown of thorns on his head. Then they begin to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him on the head. They spit on him. They beat him with a staff. They mock him. They fall on their knees. They pay homage to him. All the while, Jesus is saying nothing. My mind is drawn to the prophecy of Isaiah. I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled my beard. I did not hide my face from their mocking and their spitting. And you do understand, I hope, that during all of this, Jesus is not having fun. This is not Instagram worthy. But he is doing, in this unpleasant, ugly moment, what he is supposed to do. So that's the story. And maybe this isn't your perspective. Maybe I only feel this way because I'm young. Maybe when I'm your age, I'll see things differently. But for now, forgive me, for now, it seems to me that following the teachings of Jesus is not always what I want to do. I find, for example, nothing naturally pleasurable about loving my enemies. I don't get a kick out of forgiving those who have wronged me. I don't derive pleasure out of letting go of the past. I don't get out of bed in the morning and say today's a great day because I get to rein in my dark desires and resist my temptations and pray for those whom I would just as soon forget. In the moments of my life, I have found that there is often a disconnect, as have you, between what I want to do and what I ought to do. The situation looks often a little like this. So in a given moment I want to do something, but that something is not what I ought to do. Or I am often compelled to do something that I ought to do, but it's not what I want to do. Can you relate to the confusion? No? Yes. And the lifestyle that we are aiming for as Christians is one that looks a little more like this, I think. A lifestyle where there is no disconnect between what we want to do and what we ought to do. A lifestyle in which we find ourselves through time, practice and patience and discipline wanting to do what is right. So, question then, what do you think happiness is? Is happiness getting what I want? Or is it doing what I should? It seems to me that we all want an easy life these days. And the reason we want an easy life is, well, partly that's what social media rams down our throat. We want the emotional, mental, financial and relational equivalent of a hammock on a beach. And it's nonsense. It's nonsense. What's wrong with doing what you have to do and ignoring the fact that sometimes it's rough? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with putting up with things that are a little less than ideal, because not to do so would be to cause pain to the ones you love? What's wrong with doing what you have to because it's the right thing to do and totally ignoring the silly, trivial question of, does this make me happy? I want to slap people who say this doesn't make me happy and then proceed to tell me something that's going to cause unhappiness in the lives of others. Do you want some homework for this week? I'll give you some anyway. This week, life being life, you will have the opportunity to do what you ought to do. At some point in the next 7 days, you will get the chance to do the right thing. Either in a trivial way or a significant way. Life will give you the opportunity to do the right thing. It might be in a conversation, it might be in a leisure pursuit, it might be in a relationship, it might be a habit, whatever. And when that opportunity presents itself, you will inevitably, life being life, experience a conflict between doing the right thing and doing what you want. Doing what you want will be the easy thing. Your homework is to do the right thing and to feel good about it. And the purpose of this homework is to remind yourself that there is real pleasure to be had in doing right, in knuckling down and getting on with what you ought to, and following the teachings of your faith with all that they imply. Fair play? Can't get my watch. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we find ourselves in conflict quite often between two sides of ourselves. And no matter how long we've been on this Christian journey, that conflict shows very little sign of dying down. And so this week we ask for some courage, for some steel, and for some common sense to do what's right, to do what we ought, to hack it, to get on with it, to make it, to knuckle down. We don't want to go after the trivial pleasure. It's the long win we're looking for. The long win. And in the meantime, as we knuckle on, we thank you for your patience. We thank you for your forgiveness. We thank you for your mercy. And while we're asking you for things and thanking you for things, we ask you to be with us in our challenges and in our worries. We pray for our families this morning, for that loved one that's never, ever, ever off our mind, for that situation that never leaves us. We ask you about that one more time, and one more time, and one more time, and one more time. And one more time in faith we ask you, God, please, will you help us? Part us then with your peace and your blessing through Christ our Lord. Amen. Just a quick heads up before you go. So we've almost finished our journey in Mark. After this, I'm going to start a new series called Listening to Win. So this series is especially for you if you're trying to get through to someone and you're like banging your head off a brick wall. You just can't get through to them. So in this series I'm going to teach you some Christian principles that will help you look for the loose parts of the wall and will help break it down, and hopefully we'll get through to those people and fix things and win things. So that's coming up soon. Thank you for coming. God bless you. See you next week.